I've finally taken some time recently to watch Neon Genesis Evangelion, and more to rewatch a fair bit of it, and more to try and understand most of it. It's hard to put into words how I feel about something so prolific, so meaningful to so many, and yet so meaningless to others, and so perfectly expressive of depression, of a lot of our current states. With differing yet alike endings and complete abstraction for multiple episodes, it's justifiably nondescript in much of what it says. But one thing about NGE can never be nondescript: the character. With the world destroyed, left only to their own minds where they can judge each other for all eternity, we see the true selves of all. We can look at who they are, what they've done, what they wanted to do. They have complex reasons to achieve simple ends. They're relatable like no other, sympathetic and clear in their real world agony as their world crumbles underneath them. There's no real villains, no form to the antagonists, at points, even none to reality itself. It's unsatisfying in both its light and dark moments. The heroism toned down by feral mechas, teenage melodrama, angelic cannibalism, simple desires, and terrible actions on every side. The characters of NGE are probably terrible people. Yet I understand and find myself in all of them, and many of you probably do too. It seems to ask us to question ourselves and the characters alike. If we relate to them but can't justify their actions, then we're just like these awful people? Like admitting that we ourselves are terrible? But if they're not terrible, do we have to justify their actions to live with our own? Where lies the blame? Is it the factors around them, society, humanity, or even God? At the end of the day, I think it asks, is humanity itself terrible? Is it just in our nature to be so? Is it outside factors? Is it a failure of God? Because NGE is full of less than spotless people, and their actions determine the fate of humankind, a fate which came about on their father's shoulders. Those who make us ask if they crafted terrible people, or if people are simply terrible. Is humanity, the 18th angel, the same fabric of those who attempted to annihilate them, inherently terrible, or are we simply the construct of a hostile environment which demands our failure? When our fate rests on a boy as broken as Shinji, are we placing false hope on someone unworthy, or is that act a selfish push by an inherently selfish species? Shinji is awful, that's fairly undeniable. He's a weak person who acts reactively to the melding of all humanity into one, rather than taking any proactive action. The entire end of Evangelion is mostly just Shinji giving up. The simple idea of acceptance drops all his guards as the only barrier left between existence and the great unknown. He continues giving up. He sees Karu's face once more and believes his pain could be taken away. Taken away like it was before, for that brief, fleeting moment. And he's the same with Asuka. After having her mind torn apart by the 15th angel, left in a state with no will or desire left in her being, she's greeted by one thing.
助けて助けてよアスカ
Scared of Rei after what he's seen, Misato unavailable in her own grief, Shinji turns to someone who can't say yes, but can't say no either. So he takes what little he can grab for himself of her being. This moment, for how unforgivable and disgusting and everything wrong that it is perfect for Shinji. It's stupid and childish and disgusting and real. Real in the sense that it's a sort of depressing realism, a compromise where he's trying to take something he wants, but also not letting anyone get past arm's length, that forcibly keeping them there, and then complaining when he doesn't have anyone closer, even though he's the one keeping them at arm's length. It sums up Shinji very well. He's looking at the last possible person and saying, accept me, pushing his entire reason for being onto her, but giving her no reason to provide it for him. But you could say that he does in some ways. He saves her from a slow death in the depths of a false hell, fights alongside her, and engages with her greatest want. And in that moment, you could say that he's simply being used for her reason of existence, albeit with a lot more consent. He says, "I can only hurt others," but whatever his intentions, he saves Nerve again and again, Rei and Asuka alike, and often doesn't get much in return. Sometimes not even simple words. Every time he quits for himself, he comes back. Whenever they try to force him to kill, he refuses. And even after that, he comes back again. Is he really as terrible as he seems, as terrible as his own mind would lead us to believe? But what if that help he gives is just obligation? Following orders at all times, never thinking for himself, can that ever be called anything more than obligation? Is he really helping? Is he really helpful to Asuka, or is he just doing what his father may praise him for? Does he save Rei, who's mostly cold and distant to him, out of care for another human, or because his father loves or at least needs her, and saving her life may earn the attention he never had? Or even more, is he simply so lonely, so desperate for even just the look from a woman, that he'd be willing to destroy his own body for it? We can also look at what I'll confidently call one of the most striking scenes in anime, where Asuka accidentally lays down beside Shinji rather than in her own room. It's possible to say Shinji doesn't kiss her because he realizes his affection would be misplaced, just as she says mama. That something in his being spoke up at just the right moment and said, "This isn't right." But given what he does later, it's just as possible that he sees that moment, that softness and vulnerability he was about to take for his own, not as an acceptance of him, but the want of acceptance from another party, one that was distinctly not him. The attention of what he hardly ever had. A mother. For someone so craving of acceptance, to take it in a bastardized form would be a simple dirty bandage. You could say the issue is gone, but beneath the surface it's just festering and growing more, infected and disgusting. Shinji is a terrible person, but we didn't take into account every factor. If I looked at Shinji in the worst light, then I have to for Asuka as well. I don't want to, and I would rather not defend Shinji's actions against or independent of hers, but can we call her all that clear either? Again, with that practice kiss, with the constant anger she throws his way, the demands reaction, kicking him out of his own room with so much stuff that you couldn't miss it, even laying down next to him that night may have been on purpose. A subconscious desire for warmth from any outlet. All of her actions spew, "Look at me, look at me, look at me." When she fights by Shinji's side, is it just because he's a constant set of eyes and nothing more? Someone to witness her grand acts in that very moment? If she had it her way, that's all the others would do. Just watch. Provide her the basic need she's always desired. Who's there? Who cares? It just matters that you are. Exist near me so that I can show you I exist. Asuka is a terrible person. But there's even more. That was with the complete mental destruction of the Eva units, with Asuka being rejected by her only purpose, with the persistence of humanity begging Shinji to kill Kaoru, where he finally, ready to receive the acceptance of another being, instead became the rejecter at his desire's request. Now, I think it's very obvious and very plain to see that Kaoru was rushed, being present for only episode 24, a single episode. I have problems with how it was only a singular episode, and in a worse anime he would stick out like a sore thumb, but it's almost fitting that Shinji was so captivated in such a short amount of time, with words he could hardly comprehend. Kaoru was foreign in every way to Shinji, but one thing made all of that irrelevant. It speaks to the absolute desperation present in himself that he would feel so strongly in such a short amount of time. So strongly that his desperation was able to break the limits of all his previous desires. What mattered in those moments, the closest he's ever been to another being in an intimate setting, wasn't who it was, where it was, why it was, just that it was. It's safe to say that could have been anyone. Think about the moments in his own head where Rei, Asuka, and Misato all ask him, "Don't you want to become one with me?" repeating the same mantra that he'd love to hear, each adding no variation spare the bare essentials of their personality. They move the same way, say almost the same words, and have the exact same intentions in these moments in his mind. They are one thing right then: women. Asuka even calls this out in his behavior later, saying,
嘘ね。あんた誰でもいいんでしょ。
the object of his affection doesn't matter, just that there is one who will take it and who will return it unto him. And that's just like Asuka. Maybe that's why he attacks her in their own minds right there, because he can't stand hearing it from the person that he'd want to say it to. As long as someone is there, someone to ensure they have value and exist, that person can be anyone, do anything, exist. Exist so that I can too. To reduce those around them to something so basic, so selfish, paints them as awful people, and deservedly so. But we have to remember where they are. Their lives in this moment revolve around one thing: saving all of humanity in one of the most painful and mentally destructive ways in the most vulnerable times of their lives. They don't even have time to try and form positive relationships if they wanted to. Is she terrible, or is it just evolution and adaptation, knowing that no one can ignore the grandest of acts, whatever their state? No one can ignore you saving humanity. Is he terrible, or is it demanded of him? Humanity required him to squash his hopes at a simple, basic desire, one that every narrative, every story, every tale includes within itself. Even history and science, the most factual we can get as a society, are still inseparable from subjectivity and narrative. We learn about nations and discoveries via singular men, their myths of heroism and the spoils of becoming the victor, which damps crushing reality. We learn of their loves, desires, and how they present even in this day in the places and things they created. Nothing in the world can be viewed entirely devoid of narrative, and narrative deems that the protagonist should do great things, heroic acts, sacrifice for love, and, if even in death, come out on top. Trained into us from day one is the idea that main characters do great things, and what are we but the main characters of our own lives, our own stories, which we perceive from our own narrative. So yeah, Shinji is gonna feel like a fucking failure, a pointless waste of space who can't succeed in anything but inflicting pain on others because that's what he has to do. Asuka is gonna feel the pressure to succeed and be watched at every turn, because if she isn't, in this moment, it means humanity is dying under her watch. Giant mechas, saving humanity, fighting conspiracy, that's all heroism, a perfect story which we'd love to be the main character of. But it's not about that. It's about the toll of being a hero, one who's disposable if they fail, one whose entire life is consumed by the nature of their being, who only succeed because of the will of their mothers. The mothers they never had. Heroes who never get to be heroes. This world demands personal failure and destruction no matter the outcome. Evangelion doesn't present us with heroes because the world was incapable of crafting them. Shinji, Asuka, Rei, Misato, all of Nerve, everything is simply the playthings of ambitious power holders like Ikari and Seal, whose actions devastated young minds to achieve their goals. Asuka pushes forward in Unit 02 for the attention of the world, filling the gaps left by a mother who loved her but was incapable of expressing that to anything but a doll. Rei is simply the result of man playing God and serves nothing but the purposes of her creators. And Shinji is desperately searching for anyone who could rid him of loneliness, but with no idea how to earn that acceptance from anyone. The sins of the father may be the most Evangelion applicable sentence in this way, and might be the answer to whether humanity is flawed in nature or simply the result of the actions of those before us. If Shinji's father had ever moved on, allowed himself to work at the future rather than the past, his son rather than his wife, maybe things would have been different. Maybe Shinji would have spurred his comrades on to a distinctive victory and prevented the collective unconscious of humanity from Seal's grasp, whether the end result was positive or not, out of some love for our flaws rather than a lack of action from pure hatred of our shortcomings. Maybe Asuka, one not discarded for a doll, would have been able to keep a cooler head in battle and persevered past the angels, not lost her mind in the mental fuckery imposed on her from a need to be watched. Maybe Misato and Ritsuko could have been brilliant somewhere where they were more than just the pawns of a devious and choicefully blind man, where their actions allowed humanity to evolve naturally as it saw fit to a brighter tomorrow, than just to one where the past was substituted as the bastardized ideal future. The best and the brightest, the strongest and the most enduring, are nothing more than pawns, replaceable at every turn, with not just the bodies of their very friends, but false versions of their own consciousness, one that couldn't object to the command of a false god. These fathers, these terrible parents, are not just playing God. In many ways, they are gods, toying with the lives of their offspring at every turn, looking down on them from above, building cities above their heads, and even creating their very own life forms. If God exists, these are the men who spit in his face. Cold and uncaring, those under them cling to the faith that maybe Father can change and bestow grace upon the world once more, when all he has planned is yet another great flood. Shinji and Asuka aren't terrible people, they have terrible makers. Abhorrent creators who demand too much, gave too little, and forced death into the world at every chance. The gods of these children's world are nothing more than the flesh and blood which bore them. We can blame the shortcomings of Shinji and crew on those who came before them, and it does seem to fit. Their shortcomings are simple and derived from a lack of nourishment so early on. But then, don't we have to do the same for those before them? How did Ikari, Yui, and Seal's council fail? Was that also from their influences? What they desire is not much different from those younger. Lost connection, filling the holes in their hearts, love. To force a solution to the human condition requires a heavy dose of it. If we accept the sins of the father, then we must accept the sins of the grandfather, and the great-grandfather, and so on until there was no more room to backpedal, no way we could push failure to the past anymore, and we were forced to confront how we became such a sad state. Forced to realize that we are just terrible people. Awful souls who pass failure on, compounded and fracturing to those after us who do the same. We are forced to reconcile or meet our maker. Forced to take up the case of Adam versus God. If we are the children of Lilith, those cast out into an unknown world on a seed of life for the sins of one man, then where does the blame lay? If we were cast out of heaven for the mistakes of our ancestor, one who couldn't control his desire, then is that the root of our despair? Is that the answer to our question, that the sins of the father carry to the future like we just said? Or do we have to look at Father in a different light? Do we place the sins on the one who decided the temptation should even exist in the first place? The one who put something we could never have before us as if a mockery to our very weakness, to the fact that we were less than he. If we can only look to the past for our failures, then eventually we have to accept a world with no past, a creation which must contain the ire of humanity, something within our creation which deems us to be so flawed. God in whatever form it may take, whether it's chemicals in the brain, errors in our DNA, dark spots on the souls, or a man in the clouds. Everything must come from something, and existence is necessary for something. To say the past was our failure was really to be no better than Ikari, a man who would forsake the future for the past. But to say it's something that's just in us, present and unavoidable, is being no better than Shinji, who only runs from displeasure and says the world could never understand him. That hundreds of thousands of years, billions of lives, could never depict what his own brain comprehends. A thought which devalues humanity's togetherness and amplifies the loneliness of separated consciousness, the loneliness of the so-called AT field. We reached a very circular logic here where nothing serves an end besides the persistence of itself. We have questions that can never be answered. Questions that demand us to ask if God even exists before we could think of answering them. If maybe he did, but died long ago and left us solely to our own devices. And maybe that's the point, that we can search all day and never find the answer. Look at the toll it took for Shinji just to understand the search for acceptance. Every mind he's known, working at once, trying to show him the truth, free of physical limitations. The world now a simple husk watched over by a fallen angel, and all just to end up where they once were, but understanding each other a little bit more. Is that the cost of knowledge? The cost of our questions? And even then, it wasn't enough on its own. This final moment, where Shinji is forced to check if rejection and acceptance truly exist once more, strangling his only contact left on the decaying corpse of Earth. Maybe all that struggle, even after their understanding, is what's so disgusting. That it took all of that for a simple caress. What we see here is rejection and acceptance at once, finding one through the other. This, like how we tackled things in this very video, reduces the world to binary choices. Simple yeses and nos. Do you reject me? If not, then you must accept me. It's defined that way, but very few things are ever black and white. Evangelion is one of those things. It's possible to find so much differing meaning in it because it doesn't give us right or wrong, good or evil, rejection or acceptance. It gives us the middle. Hopeful despair, loving assault, romantic rejection. I can't tell you what to take from that. I can't tell you what NGE means, if we're terrible people by us or by nature. I'll never have any of those answers. But speaking these words makes me appreciate how episode 26 ends a little bit more. Shinji rejects this black and white nature he viewed before and focuses on one thing, that he is him and that's all he could ever be, the gray area of existence and happiness itself. So please, take care of yourself.